All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating, in-depth study. We're going to put on our biblical researcher hats and methodically unpack a pretty compelling historical theory about the origins of the standard Islamic narrative. Now, everything we're looking at today comes directly from a presentation by scholar Andan and Dr. J. Smith over on the YouTube channel Events and History. If you want to check out their full original presentation for yourself, there's a link to it right down below in the description. So let's explore how early political realities might have actually, over time, shaped the religious texts and the grand historical narratives that have been handed down to us today.
Here is the roadmap for our investigation today. 1. The historical mystery. 2. Inheriting fragments. 3. The Abbasid legitimacy crisis. 4. Constructing a prophet. 5. Retrofitting evidence. And 6. Rethinking narratives.
Section 1. The historical mystery, uncovering the gap.
When you actually lay out the timeline of these events, you immediately hit this massive, sweeping gap of about 200 to 300 years. Think about that for a second. On one end, you've got the actual events of the 7th century, the early conquests, the pre-Islamic realities. But it isn't until 765 AD that Ibn Ishaq drafts early biographical accounts. Then, those are edited by Ibn Hisham around 830 AD, and we don't get the really expansive, standardized narratives compiled by al-Tabari until the 10th century. So as researchers, we absolutely have to ask the question, why in the world did it take 2 to 3 centuries to write down these extensive standardized biographies? Why is there such a huge delay between the actual historical events and the emergence of this massive standard narrative?
Well, an early 20th century French scholar named Henri Lamens offered a really interesting potential answer. He pointed out that the Sirah, which is the traditional biography of the Prophet, was essentially exegetical. Now, what does that mean in plain English? It means this huge body of literature wasn't just some neutral, objective recording of history. Not at all. It was meant to be a commentary in action. It was literally an interpretive tool created long after the fact, specifically to explain and provide context for texts that already existed.
Section 2. Inheriting fragments, a complex landscape.
You see, there's this incredibly stark contrast between the messy historical reality on the ground and the neat religious narrative we get later. The empires emerging at this time inherited a totally chaotic 7th century landscape. We're talking warring Arab leaders, early Arab-Nazarene alliances, weird obscure texts, and these massive Umayyad monuments. It was a giant puzzle. But if you look at the standard Islamic narrative, it presents this highly streamlined, unified, brand new religion based right out of Mecca. The researchers basically argue that all of this messy, inherited historical reality somehow had to be shoved into a very neat, unified box.
Which brings us to a really crucial distinction, building a religion from scratch versus retrofitting one. The study points out that when a religion is totally invented from scratch, say like Mormonism in the 19th century, the founders can literally just write a brand new holy book to perfectly match whatever narrative they want. But the rulers in the 8th and 9th centuries, they didn't have a blank slate. They were forced to retrofit their new religious framework around all these pre-existing non-Islamic puzzle pieces. They had giant monuments and ancient texts sitting right there that they simply couldn't erase or sweep under the rug.
Section 3. Abbasid legitimacy crisis, rulers of God's kingdom.
So enter the Abbasids. The Abbasids were the ruling dynasty that inherited this incredibly vast empire, but as we all know, with immense power comes a desperate need for legitimacy. The researchers hypothesized that to actually justify their absolute political power, to prove they were the true rulers of God's kingdom on earth, the Abbasids needed a divine narrative. They needed theological backing to justify their political dominance.
Section 4. Constructing a Prophet, the 5 Pillars of Invention.
Dr. J. Smith and Auden break down exactly why the Abbasids specifically needed the character of Muhammad to solidify their rule. They methodically lay out 5 primary reasons, kind of like an architectural blueprint. First off, the Jews and Christians already had their own prophetic lines, so the Arabs needed one too. Second, they had a text, the Quran, but they really needed to impose a specific narrative context onto it just to make it make sense. Third, like we mentioned, they had all this massive historical baggage they couldn't just destroy. Fourth, they needed to appropriate these powerful, elevated titles that were previously used by the Umayyad dynasty. And fifth, the researchers argue the caliphs desperately needed a paradigm to justify their own brutal political behavior.
Now this is where the physical, epigraphic evidence is just fascinating. The researchers point to early inscriptions and coins that show leaders like Abd al-Malak using the term Muhammad. But here's the catch. Initially, Muhammad literally just translated to the praised one. It wasn't a name, it was an honorific title of elevation. Think of it like calling someone your majesty or the great. It was a widely recognized political title, long before it was ever personified into one specific historical guy.
According to this theory, the transformation happens step by step. Step 1, the Abbasids claim this pre-existing Umayyad title of the Praised One. Step 2, they personify that title, taking this abstract honorific and molding it into a concrete historical man. And finally, step 3, once you've invented the man, the scholars suggest you have to fabricate a rich, detailed backstory for him. You give him a hometown like Mecca, and you fill his life with specific anecdotes. The researchers actually compare this whole process to the creation of legends like Robin Hood or King Arthur. You take a tiny grain of distant historical memory, and you build a massive artificial narrative around it.
Section 5. Retrofitting evidence, texts and monuments. A truly perfect example of this retrofitting concept is the Isra and Miraj, the night journey. You might know this as the legendary narrative of a miraculous journey by night from Mecca all the way to Jerusalem and then up into the heavens. Well, the researchers suggest this story was basically a brilliant narrative tool. It was invented specifically to retrofit new religious meaning onto an immovable, pre-existing monument that otherwise made absolutely zero sense in their new standard narrative. And what was that massive monument? It was the Dome of the Rock. If you picture it, it's this imposing, magnificent structure sitting right there in the middle of Jerusalem. Historically speaking, the researchers argue it was originally built by earlier rulers as a huge political and theological flex against Byzantine Christianity. It was literally built to look down upon the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But generations later, the Abbasids obviously couldn't just tear it down, so the theory goes they created the story of the night journey to retroactively give this giant building a brand new, strictly Islamic reason for existing.
This idea of retrofitting also makes total sense of the Sirah and the Hadith. We're talking about enormous, incredibly dense bodies of biographical and anecdotal literature written centuries later. Why so much writing? The study argues these texts were specifically designed to force an Islamic explanation onto highly ambiguous, older literature. Plus, it served a very real, very dark political purpose. If an 8th or 9th century caliph wanted to execute his political critics, his scribes could just write a story into the Hadith claiming the Prophet did the exact same thing. Suddenly, the newly minted religious history perfectly justifies the current ruler's actions.
Section 6. Rethinking Narratives, the Big Picture.
So, to pull all these threads together, the core thesis of this study basically comes down to 4 main takeaways. First, these religious narratives evolved slowly over centuries. They absolutely did not just pop up overnight. Second, pre-existing monuments and texts were boldly and creatively reinterpreted to fit a totally new mold. Third, and honestly perhaps most importantly, political power actively shaped theology. The needs of the empire dictated the creation of the religion, not the other way around. And finally, the earliest physical and textual evidence we have on the ground often directly contradicts the neat, standard stories that were written hundreds of years later.
Which leaves us with a pretty massive, provocative question to close out this study. If the earliest monuments and texts truly tell a vastly different story than the neat narratives written centuries later, how must we completely re-examine the relationship between history, memory, and political power? It really challenges us to look closely at how ancient political ambitions construct the very historical and religious narratives we inherit today. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the source material. Remember to check out the link below for the full presentation by Events in History, and keep asking those big questions.